Good evening, and thank you for coming to our event, What You Need to Know About PFAS and Why You Should Care. This will be a recorded event. I am Representative Wendy Thomas, representing the town of Merrimack, New Hampshire, a town that has been heavily impacted by industrial PFAS contamination. I am one of the original water warriors elected to fight the mighty Goliath that is PFAS in our environment. We have made progress in the last 2 years, but we still have miles to go. I will be your moderator tonight. With us, we have a distinguished panel of some of the most qualified voices in the nation to speak about PFAS and its impact on your health and the environment. Each panelist has their own unique perspectives on PFAS and PPE issues and will introduce themselves. There will be a short presentation on the history of PFAS, and then we will open up the event to questions. We will start with questions that were submitted ahead of time, and if time permits, there will be an opportunity to ask questions live. It is our intent that you leave this discussion having a better understanding of what PFAS is, why you should be concerned, and steps you can take to eliminate it from our environment and lives. This is our first virtual PFAS and Firefighter PPE event, so please bear with us as we navigate this new format. Before we get started, instead of taking a group photo, we're going to take a group screenshot. So everyone smile.
At 8/7 Central on CBS. Jimmy is a Boy, Save From Leukemia by Dr. Sydney Farber.
Okay, and Dana Knight, you've got to put yourself on mute.
Okay.
And so now, without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce Rob Bilott. Rob is a partner in Taft's environmental litigation and product liability and personal injury groups. For more than 29 years, Rob has handled a wide variety of highly complex environmental matters and related toxic tort litigation for a diverse array of clients, including the nation's first cases involving PFAS drinking water contamination. To date, Rob has secured benefits in excess of $1 billion for clients impacted by PFAS contamination, including through key leadership positions in the nation's first class action, personal injury, medical monitoring, and multi-district litigation and trials. In 2017, Rob received the International Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, for his decades of work on PFAS issues. Rob is the author of the book Exposure, Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 20-Year Battle Against DuPont. And his story is the inspiration for the new motion picture, Dark Waters, from Participant Media and Focus Features, starring Mark Ruffalo as Rob. His story is also featured in the documentary available on Netflix, The Devil We Know. Rob is a graduate of New College in Sarasota, Florida, and has a Juris Doctorate degree from the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. We are so excited to have you here tonight, Rob. Thank you for joining us. You're going to have
Thank you. Now I'm muted. Thank you. It's really my pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone for having this event. It's just incredibly important that we are speaking and discussing this topic. We're here to talk about per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, quite a mouthful. PFAS, known as forever chemicals now. And these are chemicals that came out onto the market right after World War II. It's been 70, almost 80 years that these chemicals have been out there, being manufactured, being released, getting into our air, our soil, our water, the blood. But it's only now that most of us are even learning that they're out there, that they've been there likely for quite some time in our drinking water, in our blood, in our soil, in the products that we purchase, in the items that we wear. And we'll talk about that later tonight, some of the clothing and things that we have been purchasing for years. So, it has only been really within the last 20 years that we've had efforts underway to really try to get information out about what these chemicals are. And it's taken a long time, and it's taken a great amount of effort to get the information out to the public, to the rest of the world, that these chemicals exist, where they've been used, what products they've been used in, where they've been released. And it's only been within the last couple of years that we've actually had sampling going on across the country and now in other parts of the world as well, looking for these chemicals. And almost every day in the last year or 2 years, really, you're having some new community somewhere, either in the United States or in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, learning that these chemicals are in their water, trying to find out information about what is this stuff? What do we know about them? Are they dangerous? Are they harmful? Or finding out that these chemicals have been used for quite some time in a product that's being used, or at a company down the street that's been emitting it into the air for decades. So it's been quite difficult to get the information out from within internal company files about what these chemicals are, what effects they may have, and the extent to which they are out there in our environment. And I've been doing everything I can as a lawyer, and I'm here tonight speaking in my own individual capacity. I'm not here representing any client or speaking on behalf of anybody, but just to give you some history and some background as to how we got here and why we're having this conversation. But I've been doing everything I can to try to get this information out, and it's been really encouraging in the last couple of years to see information finally making its way out across the country about the existence of these chemicals and what different products they are in. People asking questions, about, are they in these materials? Are they in these products? How do we test for it? The movie Dark Waters has been tremendously helpful in getting that discussion going. The documentary, The Devil We Know, I put together the book as well, Exposure, just to try to give people this history of how did we get here.
Who's on that movie that came out, Dark Waters? He was a big-time lawyer that was going after.
Excuse
I'm
me.
sorry. Anyway, but but we are now here tonight, fortunately, continuing that discussion, and it's great. There are discussions like this occurring all across the country, different communities that are getting together. There are communities that have been impacted by water contamination. I was just on another call this evening with folks in Vermont, that are struggling with this in the water. But as most of this information's come out, really the focus historically up to now has been on water, that it's in drinking water, that it's been found in water supplies, as it should be. We should be making sure those exposures are stopped, that people aren't drinking this every day. But there's been relatively little done to date to look at the other sources for these chemicals out in the environment, all of the different products that they've been used in over the years, stain-resistant carpetings and clothing, fast food wrappers, packaging, and what we're going to talk about tonight, with the firefighting community and the extent to which these chemicals may have been used in the past with coatings used in turnout gear and in firefighting foams. Only now are people really starting to look at those issues, and it's incredibly important that we do, and it's incredibly helpful that we've got folks like Dr. Peasley here on the line with us tonight, who's been really leading the efforts and looking into, in particular, the extent to which these chemicals may have been used in coatings on firefighting gear and equipment in the past. We've got a community here of firefighters and emergency responders who have been literally bathing in some of these chemicals for decades through the use of firefighting foams. We've, I think, all seen the videos online of people wading through the foam in hangars and in airports and in military bases. And there's been a lot of focus on the foam. And we want to make sure that we also know the extent to which firefighters are also getting exposed in any of the gear or any of the other equipment that they're wearing. These are incredibly important questions for us to understand what's the full extent of people's exposure, particularly in the firefighting community, those that we're asking to help protect us. We need to make sure you're being protected and the firefighters are being protected. So, and I'm probably speaking too long, but I just want to thank everybody here tonight. This is an incredibly important discussion. These are incredibly important questions. And it's really encouraging to know that we've got people like Dr. Peasley, people like Diane and her husband Paul, people like Jeff, people like Wendy Thomas that are taking these issues up, asking these questions, looking for the answers, and hopefully we can all learn a lot and hopefully take additional steps to help protect us and those in the firefighting community, the emergency response community, and actually hopefully make sure that these ongoing exposures stop and we find better and new ways of doing things in the future. So thank you all. I really look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for your valuable insight. Next, we're delighted to introduce Diane Cotter and her husband, Paul, who have been on the front lines since day one protecting our firefighters from PFAS in their equipment. Diane is a fire wife and advocate for first responders' PFAS exposure. Diane and Paul share a leadership role in the National PFAS Contamination Coalition for their community of first responders. Prior to Paul's cancer diagnosis in 2014, Diane worked as a waitress, hairdresser, and sales representative for a communications company. She retired in 2010. In 2015, during Paul's cancer recovery, Diane began the investigation into the chemicals used in firefighter turnout gear, leading to a rabbit hole of epic proportions. Since then, both Diane and Paul have been raising awareness of PFAS contamination in firefighters and will not stop until all firefighters are protected. Thank you for being with us tonight, Diane and Paul.
Thank you, Rep. Thank you all. My name is Paul Cotter. I was a firefighter in Worcester Fire Department in Massachusetts for 27 and a half years. In September of 2014, I was promoted to lieutenant. 1 month later, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. After my surgery in 2015, I was able to retire on a disability pension. After several years of investigating, we've been able to identify chemical coatings built into all turnout gear that may be linked to many of the cancers in firefighters today. Our goal is to make the fire service aware of these highly guarded secrets and to replace suspected carcinogens with safer alternatives and to make the job safer for future generations of firefighters. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thank you to my husband, Paul, and thank you to everyone here on the panel with us this evening. I'd like to just give you a moment of our background, if I can, and when Paul was diagnosed with his career-ending cancer in 2014, and then with his surgery in 2015, Paul was no longer able to perform the duties of a firefighter and retired in his 27th year of the career. While Paul was recuperating from surgery, I would learn that Europe was beginning a transition or a potential transition to what they called non-PFOA PPE. That was shocking to us because we had never heard of that before. And I would begin to ask about this on my own personal Facebook page. In 2016, someone who's turned out to be a good friend, Jason Burns, the president of Local 1314, he asked me to send him any material that I had about this because he had just lost two 30-year-old firefighters to a rare brain cancer. We would then come to learn that the fire station in Fall River would use AFFF to wash the walls within their firehouse and would use it to wash their trucks, etc. We would also learn that Fall River has the highest, or has a rate of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or cancer that Dana-Farber said is statistically impossible. So these things stick with us. Jason would then take the information that I had given him to our labor union leadership, which is the International Association of Firefighters, during their legislative week in Washington, D.C. I think that was in 2016 or 2017, and he would inquire if there was information available. It was at that point that we understood that it caused quite a commotion, and maybe at that point we should have began to understand that this was going to be a lot more upsetting than we had thought. We had hoped that by telling the institutions that protect us that we would be protected and that remedies would be very quick, and that didn't happen. In 2017, I'll just fast forward, that we had seen the 196-page letter that Rob Bilott wrote to the U.S. EPA, CDC, ATSDR, and U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions at that time. And Rob had indicated that he, along with Dr. Paul Brooks from the C8 Science Panel and Fire Chief Jeffrey Herms, would threaten to sue if firefighters and first responders did not get the health studies and medical monitoring that he was asking for. In 2017, we were lucky enough to find Dr. Graham Peasley, who I pleaded with to help us, and he was gracious enough to answer the call. And we sent him our first set of turnout gear that was circa 2004. He tested it, and from there, I'll leave that to him to tell you the story. So, but we want to thank everybody here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane and Paul, for your tireless advocacy in protecting our firefighters. Next, it is our pleasure to introduce Jeff Knabe. Jeff was a reserve firefighter with Alameda County Fire Department for 20 years, from 1998 to 2019. Jeff has also worked in the PPE care and maintenance business of firefighting turnouts for the past 10 years. Jeff is currently a PPE specialist with a fire department in Northern California, and he is another tireless advocate for protecting our firefighters from PFAS contamination in their gear. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for letting me be part of this conversation about PFAS in firefighter PPE. I've worn PPE turnouts for 20 years and never knew about this potentially carcinogenic PFAS coating until about 3 years ago, when I found Diane on her Facebook page. At first, you don't want to believe it, but after doing my research, it opened my eyes to what's really on the gear, and I joined our small core group of folks to figure out what was actually in the turnout gear to make the fire service a little bit safer. What I'd like to go over right now is kind of what we can do to minimize some of the exposures to the fire service community and the families that those firefighters belong to. As the gear ages, the finish that's on the outer shell actually degrades through UV exposure and high temperature. It falls off and it gets collected into the dust. And if you've ever gone into a PPE storage room, you can see that there's going to be dust all around. If you agitate that dust and get that dust airborne, then you have what they call as inadvertent ingestion of dust that may or may not contain the PFAS chemicals. You don't want to do that. That's a no-no. The best thing to do is don't sweep out any PPE storage rooms, you want to vacuum out with a HEPA filter, or actually hose down the floor and the walls of the PPE storage room, enables to protect your respiratory system from any airborne particulates. Some of the other things is we want to acknowledge that prior to 2014, the all gear prior to 2014 can contain a known carcinogenic compound called PFOA. That's a fact. That statement's been made by at least one manufacturer of turnout gear. All gear that's post 2014 is albeit PFOA free. It is not PFAS free, which means there's still some sort of PFAS chemicals in the finish. There are some manufacturers that are looking at having a PFAS free finish. Those hope to come out within this calendar year or the first part of next year. So that's why I want to be part of this coalition to just educate the fire service and the general public about the potential exposure risks of firefighter turnouts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We're so grateful for your depth of knowledge and your advocacy for our firefighters. Finally, we're excited to introduce Dr. Graham Peasley, who will give us a short presentation on PFAS chemicals. Dr. Peasley is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. His research group studies the fate and transport of environmental hazards such as PFAS, with particular emphasis on how to rapidly measure and screen for the presence of chemicals of concern. He works with communities, organizations, and companies to help eliminate non-essential uses of PFAS. Thank you for being with us tonight, Graham. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Wendy. And I guess I'm going to have to learn how to share screen in a second here. I think Chris needs to turn it on. But I'm proud to be with this esteemed group of panelists up here. You've heard all that I need to say is already been said, but it's really the work of the community itself, the firefighting community, to be interested in this, and it's led by Diane because she stumbled upon it first, and the rest of the people have simply bowed to her will. She sent us an email that said, what is going on? And we've actually discovered something about that, and I'm trying to tell you that tonight. There we go. Let's see if I can. I still don't have permission to share my screen because I need Chris to turn me on. You need to turn on the share screen capability on Zoom. If you right click on it, you can allow multiple participants to share. Is Chris still there?
Chris? Well, okay. Do a little background and then I'll find Chris.
It's just he's host, so he's got to turn on the screen sharing. I have a short presentation. Most of you will know all the details on it. What it is a simple background on where PFAS came from, why we're worried about them, and where they get to. And the most important thing to realize is that they're forever chemicals, that they are extremely good at what they do. They're the world's best surfactants, and we've put them in everything as a result. And that means that they're in all sorts of different product uses. And that means that we will find them for hundreds, if not thousands of years to come. And I think that we're only just beginning to realize how widespread this was. And it was because of the companies that made it. They found uses for it and then therefore increased the volume they could sell. And they didn't begin to realize, well, they realized several decades ago, of course, that this was probably not a good thing. Whenever you make a chemical that never goes away, every single molecule of it stays around. And that means that they build up in places that you don't want them to. For example, in the body or in the environment. And we see them in polar bear livers, we see them in humans, and they're getting more pervasive. And then we begin to understand their toxicity and that the fact that they do cause disease. We've focused on cancer in this discussion, but it also causes a bunch of other diseases as well that we know about. There we go. I think I can do that now. How about we go to a show, so I'm not doing hand puppets all the time. And what I'm going to do is go back to here. Yep. Can you see that screen?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about. PFAS are organic compounds that are entirely man-made. There are no natural PFAS that are significant. They were developed around World War II, as was said. They've got an amazing array of names. They're organofluorine compounds, they're perfluorinated compounds, the old name. Around 2011, we've all decided to call them PFAS. That's a confusing acronym. It stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, but they are, there's also one called PFAS, which sounds very similar. And you'll see labels PFAS-free, which is not the same thing as PFAS-free. PFAS refers to the whole category of these things. They have incredible properties. They are the world's best surfactant, means a soap of some sort. They're used on textiles, carpets, everything you can imagine. They're used in cosmetics, they're used in machine coatings, they're used as lubricants, flame retardants, they're solvents for all sorts of things. And there are incredible pictures of what they would do on clothing there. Oh, we have a little echo. And so what we have shows the difference between when they're applied and when they're not applied to textiles. You can see an instant difference. The chemistry behind them, and many of you have seen this slide, is the fact that there's a carbon-fluorine bond, the gray to green blonde there, that is really very strong. It's the strongest single bond in chemistry, and you can rearrange them into thousands of different shapes. In fact, there are more than 4,700 of these things that have a number assigned to them, that we know what they are and why they're manufactured. But most of them we know why they're manufactured. And so these are some of the examples. They all have wonderful acronyms. There's PFOA and PFAS. Those are the two most commonly talked about ones, but there are lots of others out there. For example, the C8 study that was done in Rob's life work down in West Virginia, this is the two chemicals that were mostly focused on C8. But we're now concerned about other things like C6 and beyond. What makes them so good? They have a particular hydrophobicity, which means they don't like water on one end and they don't like oil on the other end. And that means they line the cells of things, they line water air interfaces. And it's because of the strength of that bond, water literally beads up off these things. So they're the best drying agent we've got. They also serve some other functions in different types of, they're the Teflon on your pans and things like that. Non-stick surfaces will be things made out of PFAS. There they are, Teflon pans, but they're also the Scotch Guard in your carpets or the Gore-Tex in your jackets. They're, of course, in firefighting foams. And the reason they're in firefighting foams is not to actually put out flames. They do have that function. They function at high temperature. But it's actually to make the foam encapsulate the flame and cut out the source of the oxygen and the fuel into the fire. And so these AFFFs, or the aqueous film forming foams, which are used widely, they're used in popcorn bags. Why not? It keeps the oil from leaking through the popcorn bag. And when you cut the popcorn bag open, you let the water out, okay, the steam. The bag doesn't get soggy. But is that really the best place to put your man-made chemical? Let me think about that. The military, of course, used the firefighting foam extensively for about 50 years now. It was practiced with every day on every military vessel we had, including airports, but also on ships. And this is what used to happen to it afterwards. It was safe as soap, so they washed it into the ocean. The trouble with it, if the wonderful chemical, is that it never goes away. It's got this environmental persistence of hundreds, if not thousands of years in some cases. There's no known bug that eats it. There's no known natural predator to this thing, and so it just sticks in the environment and will get into you. It has this wonderful way of bioaccumulating. It'll get into the food that you eat, the water you drink, and it will migrate through all the biota on the planet if we do it right. If it doesn't degrade, then there's this wonderful picture from a paper several years ago that you can have firefighting foam get into you directly. You can have consumer products get it into you directly, but it can go to the landfill and it passes right through, more or less unrestricted in landfills. It'll come out of the products, get into wastewater. That will be reabsorbed. It goes through wastewater treatment plants. It'll be reabsorbed right into drinking water supplies. And therefore it gets into the drinking water supplies of a large fraction of the country. Early studies back in 2016 already identified this as a problem in the US. The US particularly, it's been a problem abroad for years before this. But there's already, in this paper, identified to be thousands of millions of people exposed to PFAS in the drinking water. And as we look with better levels of detection and lower limits, we're seeing more and more drinking water affected. It's partly due to industrial pollution, partly due to inadvertent AFFF use, especially on Air Force bases. But now we're also finding that maybe other sources as well. I mentioned this briefly, but it bioaccumulates in plants and animals. So there's a wonderful story of organic eggs that were eaten by a firefighter, and he was not exposed to foam, but he ate the eggs and he was building his muscle body, so he ate lots of eggs per day. He ate it from a chicken that grew the organic eggs out in the backyard, and they fed it the fresh wheat that was organic wheat grown in the backyard of the fire station as well. And it turns out that that was right next to the fire training pit. So the wheat absorbed the PFAS went to the egg yolk is highest in the PFAS, and the firefighter was building his body up with 5 eggs a day, and he had astronomical levels in his blood. So those types, is that AFFF exposure? It wasn't direct exposure, but it was through the food that he ate or the water we drink, and that's where most of us are getting it from, I'm afraid. The disease correlations are there, and we've known this for C8 for some time. There are 6 proven associations and 25 that weren't proven, but some of them were statistically interesting, but just not significant enough. And there are 2 types of cancer, kidney and testicular cancer, known to be associated with PFAS or PFAS. Hypertension and pregnancy-induced hypertension, ulcerative colitis, and high cholesterol. These are major diseases and the focus of Rob's work to get them recognized. But that's only just 2 of the chemicals. And now we've replaced them with other chemicals in most of our products. There are undoubtedly going to be other disease effects associated with them. And I just point this out. This is the number of publications. This has really only been stumbled in the last 20 years. People began to realize, you know, this chemical is everywhere. It's showing up in everything. There's things that we now know about the thyroid and hormone balances, and a really important one, immunotoxicity. There's a study done by Philippe Grandjean that says that when they looked at vaccinated children a year later, if they had twice as high perfluorinated levels in their blood, they had half the vaccine response, which means we're suppressing the immune system. And when you suppress the immune system of a person, you open them up to all sorts of opportunistic diseases, other types of cancer, which we may not have considered at first, and other types of diseases that you can get. There were almost 1,700 papers in the scientific literature last year on PFAS, and then this year we're only halfway through, but it's going to exceed 2,000 papers. And that means that people are beginning to take a real interest in, and most of these are all related to human health. Not all, but most of them are related to human health. And I'm going to get into a couple of details just before I quit. There's a movement in the industry to say, well, yes, we know that C8 is bad. We lost a very large lawsuit to that. So we've now switched to C6, and that's perfectly safe. And the difference is that this one has 6 molecules, this one has 8 molecules. But other than that, they're identical. And so, yes, the human body can tell the difference, but I'm not sure that we can. Here's a test for the audience. If you've been paying attention, you can tell which one of these is which, right? One of these is legal to put in your AFFF and one of them is not. And yet, does it really matter? We've done a study when we looked, this is the C6 on the right, by the way. We've done a study where we put it into a mouse and it gets into blood cells. It's not fatty tissues like metals and things like that. It actually gets in the blood and is transported through the body. And we found it in every organ that the blood touched, i.e. every organ in the mouse. And when we did C8 versus C6, it went to different organs. Preferentially, it went to the liver as C8. It prefers to go to the brain and other places as C6. Oops, this is a mouse. This is not a firefighter. But it is one of those things that when you see animal studies like that, you begin to worry that, wow, what have we done? We've taken a chemical that we know is dangerous and replaced with one that we don't know anything about. And now we're starting to see published studies that maybe that isn't so good either. It might be one of these things we call a regrettable substitution. What other environmental sources that you face, being a resident of New Hampshire or anywhere in this country? Firefighting foam release is a major one. Airports will do it. Fire departments have used firefighting foams. Military bases have used it a lot. Industrial release, there's several of you that know we're better to have an industrial spill than Cape Fear, North Carolina. I mean, that's it's just appropriate, but there's many industrial spills, and you know it up in the Merrimack Valley as well. There's also yet to be discovered, but it's known in the science community already that any sort of consumer products that end up in the landfill or the compost will actually start releasing this stuff, and will for the next hundreds of years since we bury all our waste in this country. So you can look at some maps. This is the Environmental Working Group's map, which is a nice up-to-date. And it looks like Michigan's a bad place to live, as is New Jersey. That may be, but I proudly live in Michigan right now. So it's really the states that have started looking, and New Jersey has led the way. Minnesota's done some work, but it's really Michigan that's ground central for the last year, since they got hit by 3 different things at once. And Flint didn't help. That was a lead poison, but got people looking at their water in a hurry. And it's the first state to start looking at every mandated look at every water supply. And of course, suddenly the dots start to multiply. I'm going to end up with the example that we were talking about, and I'm not going to say much about them, but the firefighters are occupationally exposed to fluorine, and they're exposed to this type of fluorine in two ways. The one that's made all the news till date has been the AFFF exposure. They actually have to lay out the foam for use on petroleum fires, and these are Class B foams. Most firefighters have worked with them at some point, trained to put them on the equipment and put fires out with them. They're used to smother the fire to create this interstitial layer between water and air. You've seen pictures where the firefighter goes and walks through without PPE on because this foam is told to them that it would be safe as soap. And for 50 years, we've been told it's safe as soap. It's not so safe. It may not kill you by ingestion directly, but it will certainly get into your body and cause disease. And then it lasts for a long time in the body and in the environment. What we did recently is we published a paper based on Diane's insistence that there might be something in her husband's gear. We looked at it, and there was a lot of fluorine there. And so we did this study at Notre Dame where we got several donated sets of gear, several dozen that we looked at. And we looked at the layers within it. There are 3 layers: the outer shell, the moisture barrier, and then a thermal liner typically. And we asked our PFAS in all the gear, and not just our husband's gear. And it turns out they're all manufactured to an NFPA standard, 1971. So they're all pretty similar in construction. They have different reflective tapes and things like that, but the material itself is all made the same way. And to get that water resistance, to prevent them from getting wet, they use perfluorinated chemicals in 2 different locations. And so we found out very quickly. Well, the next one is that does the PFAS come off? If it comes off, then we might have a serious issue because this certainly it'll come off when you throw it in the landfill at the end of use, and that's a concern for the environment. But what about the poor firefighter who's actually using this? Will this come off on them? If it doesn't, we're good. But my fear was that I've seen carpets wear with time, and they lose their water resistance. Could that be happening on the gear? And if it does come off, can it get into the firefighter? Could it be absorbed through the skin? Could it be inhaled? Or could it be just accidental hand-to-mouth ingestion of the dust that sheds off this? And so we did a study, and we recently published a paper that said, yeah, it does come off, and yeah, it's present on all the gear. We did not answer the third question. That study is still ongoing with some colleagues, but it undoubtedly represents a source of PFAS to the firefighter as they go about their job. And, I don't know if it's as bad as AFFF. I think most firefighters are drinking water that's contaminated with AFFF, not necessarily eating their gear's dust. However, what happens if you get a little bit every day? You put the gear on every day and nobody told you about it. No, you saw it on the previous slide that my students are holding the gear with gloves on because it comes off on their gloves if we handle it. Nobody told the firefighters that. And so the very first thing we want to do in the paper is just tell the fire services, treat the gear with respect. You have to wear it in a fire. It keeps you safe from flame. And therefore, you want to take it off when you're not actively fighting a fire. And that's led to policy changes, and that's an easy way to reduce your exposure. You shouldn't let the kids play in it. You shouldn't wash it with other clothing and all that sort of stuff. But the primary idea is to just keep the gear separate. The second question is, of course, why do we need it in the gear? What purpose is it serving? And it's serving a purpose to keep the gear dry. But there are several ways to keep gear dry, and it doesn't have to be fluorinated chemicals. It's the best one we've got, but that's the chemical salesman that's telling you this. There are several that can work just as well, as effectively, and there are now clothing manufacturers that have made gear that meets NFPA 1971 that are suitably water resistant. They just don't contain PFAS. So the question is, why wouldn't we design gear that doesn't have this chemical on it? And I'm going to stop there. I've got lots more details in the paper if people want to ask questions, but I think I'm trying not to eat into time, so we have time for questions. And I have my email address at the bottom if people want to speak to me directly, but I think we've got time now, Wendy, to take it back to you and see if we can answer some questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham, for that really, really important information. Before we get to questions, I'd like to let you know about an effort that Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Senator Cory Gardner have initiated in the Senate. It's the Guaranteeing Equipment Safety for Firefighters Act, and it will direct agencies to examine the identity, prevalence, and concentration of PFAS in personal protective equipment, the conditions and extent to which PFAS are released into the environment over time from the degradation of personal protective equipment, and the relative risk of exposure of PFAS faced by firefighters from their use of personal protective equipment. Also in New Hampshire, we recently passed bills that establish a PFAS remediation fund, set maximum contaminant levels for perfluorochemicals in drinking water, and which extend the Commission on the Seacoast Cancer Cluster investigations. So elected officials are paying attention, but it's up to all of us to make sure that PFAS contamination remains on their radars. Now we'll take some questions from the audience. Please enter your questions into the chat room and we'll get to as many as we can. Panelists, in order to make this run smoothly, unless a question is directed to a specific person, if you'd like to answer a question, please indicate by physically raising your hand and I will call on you. The first question: I see these people worried about the possibility of it in their tap water. Damn it, at worst, I've had the concentrated AFFF poured over me a few times, used it as shower soap, and once brushed my teeth with it. Have to say I'm very concerned that this has caused my health problems. Also worried that it's irreversible and progressive. Can't get tested anywhere, and money can't fix this. What to do? I think, Diane, I'm going to give that one to you.
Oh boy. Well, that's really something that we see regularly in the sites that we have for first responders. And we don't designate between a military, a Department of Defense first responder, and a civilian first responder. And although I know that there are designations within the Capitol Hill for that, we just see a first responder. What to do? Well, we do have a couple of options for you. First of all, what we'd really like to see you do is to become involved and be active. Wendy is going to put up some sites for you at the end of this discussion today. And what we do is we'd ask you to become a voice with us. Please go to fightforeverchemicals.com, and that is the participant dark water and environmental working group site. You'll be notified when there are actions that you can take, and you'll be able to address your own concerns by going through the site to get hooked up to your own state legislators. We'd also like you to look at our site for the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, and on that site there is plenty of resources for you. Again, although the Department of Defense is advising you not to test your blood serum, we'd like you to test your blood serum, because truly we have to have more information. We have to know what these numbers are. There's not a lot of places that will test blood serum. There's about 4 accredited sites. You'll find that information on the National PFAS Contamination Coalition site, and you'll find testing on our site, your Turnout Gear and PFOA.com as well. We'd like to see you test your fire stations for your well water, and we truly do need some type of national protocol for the 58,000 fire stations in the nation on this subject.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Okay. The next question we have is, can anyone confirm whether ARFF gear, aka baked potato silver suits, also have carcinogens in them?
Can I chime in?
Sure.
This is Jeff Warwick. I was an firefighter in the Delaware Air National Guard from 1980 until 1992. The original silvers contained asbestos.
Okay, well that answers that question.
So that's a carcinogen.
Yeah.
Later gear was aramid fiber, which Dr. Peasley talked about.
Okay.
So, yeah, my answer to that would be yes.
That they do. Okay, thank you for helping.
We didn't test the silvers specifically because I didn't have any of those in the sample set, but I believe that they have lots of things in them. But the military used the silvers extensively, and the civilians did not. So I haven't tested silvers per se, but I would be willing to bet they have many of the same sort of chemicals, if not worse.
Okay,
Thanks, Jeff.
thank you.
Yes, if a garment is certified to NFPA 1971, typically the base layer to a proximity set of firefighting gear is PBI, and then they put the foil over the top. That PBI fabric will have a DWR finish, most likely.
Okay. Thank you all for that, for those responses. The next question is, I recently learned that Vermont, as well as New Hampshire and many other New England states, are shipping barrels of PFAS to a burn facility in New York near Albany. The burn facility is next to a low-income housing community. How safe is burning PFAS, and how can we stop states from shipping their PFAS waste to other states and low-income communities to be burned?
I can answer that if you'd like. And this is my opinion, and you should certainly get lots of second opinions on this. It's a hazardous waste disposal, and so incineration is done in this country as hazardous waste disposal. If you get the temperature up to a high enough temperature, above 800 degrees centigrade, the PFAS will completely decompose, and it will go back to carbon and fluorine. And that, in my mind, is pretty safe. You don't want to breathe the fumes, but the fumes will mix with the atmosphere within seconds, and it will precipitate out as inorganic fluoride. And that's not dangerous. And so to that extent, I think it's perfectly fine. How often are the incinerators run at the right temperature, and how well managed is the facility? It's the same reasoning behind any power plant. If it's got a AAA bond rating, it's probably a pretty good plant. They follow the protocols, and their effluents and their outputs are probably fine. If it's Billy Joe Bob and his brother runs the incineration co, I'm not sure that that's run perfectly well, and there could be hazards. And the fact that it's in a low rent district, absolutely, that's been the history of all sorts of environmental pollution in this country. But I think the idea alternative is to stick it in a hazardous waste landfill, which is nothing more than a lined landfill where the leachate doesn't get out. I think that's just waiting to leave it for somebody else to solve. And I think that incineration is a good technique, but that's not the only opinion. People do have reservations about it, and I respect that, because I don't know. I didn't incinerate it myself. I didn't check the temperature. I'm hoping somebody does. And I think most of these sites are pretty regulated, but that would be something that the site has to respond to. And I think there are questions you can ask of them if you live nearby.
Okay, thank you. The next question, my friend in Indiana is married to a firefighter who has been diagnosed with brain cancer. What should I share with her?
First,
reporting of this event.
Yeah, it's a horrible diagnosis, and we know it. There's a bunch of firefighters with brain cancer. It's a very rare cancer. It's a cancer that's 1 in a million, and yet there are already 3 firefighters in South Bend who've had it in 7 years. How is that possible? And so I empathize. We can never say that any chemical caused any particular cancer. What we can show in a large enough study is that there's some correlations, and that if you have statistically a population with an elevated cancer rate, then there's a correlation to exposure to a chemical. We've never had enough brain cancers in one pot to actually show correlations that are statistically significant. But anecdotal is that, wow, there's a lot of rare cancers in the fire services. Could they be related to some of the exposure? Most likely combustion products, because that's the most carcinogenic thing we know. But it could also be from PFAS. It could also be from brominated flame retardants, all sorts of things. We can't tell. And unfortunately for the person who has cancer, it's a terrible diagnosis. How did I get picked out for this? And we can't ever say, oh, at least not in this century. Someday there might be individualized medicine. We could look at that. But at the moment, we're looking at sort of categories of people. And Rob can tell you what the statistical likelihoods of these things are. But it's one of those that it is likely to be occupational, but we don't know which of the toxins that you're exposed to cause this particular one, and it'll depend on the genetic makeup of the person as to how they're exposed. And I think that get to find other people that have been in the same situation. That's the strongest support group you can find, and they'll tell you. And Diane is very good at connecting firefighters with other firefighters. There are lots of them, and you're not alone. I think that's the strongest argument we can make. And yeah, we need to just reduce their risk in every way we can.
Thank you.
And I would just jump in to say this is one of the primary reasons why we are trying everything we can to try to make sure that big enough national studies are done of firefighters, of exposed people, looking not just at one chemical, for example, at a time. You know, the C8 studies that we've talked about that were done in West Virginia were focused on PFOA and to some degree PFOS, as Dr. Peasley said. But we know we're exposed to this mix, and particularly firefighters, you know, are exposed to the mix of PFAS materials, particularly as the newer chemicals have come out into the market and into products. We really need to have large enough studies that are looking at big enough populations at this mix to see if we can find these statistical correlations. You know, as Dr. Peasley said, you know, it's difficult, particularly with these rare cancers. You need tens of thousands of people in these studies. And I know ATSDR has announced an effort to try to do some nationwide studies. Unfortunately, you know, the funding and the population sizes are probably not going to be big enough to really comprehensively look at cancer. And they're specifically not really looking at occupational firefighter exposures. So we're really trying to find a way to get a big enough, more comprehensive study done that can actually confirm, you know, whether some of these things are linked with these different diseases. It's just incredibly difficult. Takes a lot of people to participate and a lot of money to do those kinds of studies.
Thank you. The next question is, what other products are these in, like in schools? We know in water and supplies, in our supermarkets, cars, homes. So I think they want to know other products that PFAS are in. They're in everything.
I'll jump in, and yeah, I mean, that's a good summary. They've been used in so many different products in the last 50, 60 years. You know, lots and lots of different consumer products, stain-resistant clothing, carpeting, fast food wrappers, packaging, cabling, you know, as Dr. Peasley said, microwave popcorn bags. I mean, so there's just an incredible array of different products that have used it. Unfortunately, there hasn't historically been a lot of information available to the public and to all of us to really know exactly which products use which chemicals. Unfortunately, a lot of that was claimed to be confidential business information. You know, it's only now that we're starting to really learn about the extent to which these chemicals were in various different products. So, and I know Diane mentioned some of the sites that are available online, some of the different groups, you know, that are putting information out there to try to get that kind of data out to people so they can start identifying, you know, what were the different products that these things have been used in, and more importantly, you know, which companies are switching away from them, and you know, what are the alternatives, so that people can at least start making the choice about whether they want to be exposed. Up to now, most of us haven't had that choice. We didn't even know these things were out there. So at least we're starting to get that information. It's still a slow process, though.
Thank you. Next question, what are the ranges of lifespan of pieces of turnout gear? Do they still contain much PFAS at the end of life? Where do they traditionally end up when disposed of? Jeff, maybe you can answer that one.
Okay, so the NFPA guide is turnout should be retired at the 10-year mark. Some fire departments in the United States do follow that, while some don't, just because of the associated costs with replacing some gear that might be in very usable condition. But the standard is 10 years. So at the current time, if the industry has acknowledged that PFOA was stopped use in 2014, that gear, which they term as legacy gear, will still be in service till a minimum of 2024. So we still have a few more years of that. End of life. A lot of times it's sent to Mexico to be used, the fire departments down there, because they can't afford turnouts. In some cases, gear is put on a training shelf and used in fire academies for recruits that are training to be firefighters. And in some cases, some fire departments and industry, because there is no industry standard that's set on how you're supposed to dispose of it, could just be cut up with a razor blade and thrown into the trash and gone to the landfill. And with that, I'll turn it over to Graham to speak about his concerns with the landfill and turnouts.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's perfectly right. The only other thing I'll add to it is how much is left at the end of life. When we measured it coming off, we measured a significant amount coming off, but that means that 99% of it was still there. I mean, there's a lot of water, 97%, something like that, was still on the outer shell. It's not going to do, it doesn't lose that much water resistance in 10 years, but it will have a lot of, that's because it's yay thick. It's a very thick piece of fabric, but we saw, part per million levels coming off when we rubbed it. But that means there's still 99% of it is going to be fluorinated. So when it goes in the landfill, is my greatest fear of how much is going to get exposed to the environment. Because eventually, after 30 years, 100% of that will end up in the water, and that's not just the 1% that came off. Hopefully, that answers it.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What does one do when we have the knowledge and the science to justify the need for remediation? However, your state chooses not to act to establish limits and guidelines. In Wisconsin, the trade industries have bullied the decision-making, rendering communities unable to receive financial and technical support to remediate. That's a huge problem.
Wendy, you should tell us how to do that.
Well, what you need to do is elect people who will fight for you. That's actually, there were 3 women in our town that rose, and we were the water warriors. And we went and we all got elected and went up to the State House, and we talked to everyone that we could about PFAS. And we put bills in. As a freshman representative, you're not encouraged to put bills in. And we said, well, forget about that. We got work to do. So we put bills in, and we made some differences up in Concord. So you've got to elect the people that will work for you. And if they're not going to work for you, then don't elect them.
And there are communities that are forming too. And so there's a lot of PFAS communities being formed, unfortunately. But that means that whole communities that Merrimack Valley, but also Cape Fear, also all these various locations, Hoosick Falls, all have communities that have been impacted. And you start connecting with people from that, and you'll get activism. And activism will get attention. And that works in this country very well.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is to get community-led advocacy groups. We have a fantastic one here in Merrimack that's run by Lorraine Allen. And she's gotten the word out to so many people and has made so many connections. So that's really important too. Okay, the next, in terms of occupational risks to PFAS exposure, do you think firefighters have the highest risk? Is some pre-2014 gear with PFOA still in use? What other types of jobs often have high exposures? For consumers, which products still being manufactured have the highest potential for exposing people to PFAS? Lots of questions there.
There's a lot of questions there. Firefighters have one of the highest exposures to PFAS because of AFFF, and we know that that's a source. But they may also get it from the gear. And that may be, is it better to have a high source once a year or a low source you wear every day? It's hard to tell. My guess is AFFF wins, but I don't know that. The next thing is there are some occupations that are higher. If you are a ski waxer, professional ski waxer, you have very elevated, the ski waxes were all fluorinated until the Olympic Committee banned them this year. And so that means that all the Nordic ski waxers that were professional waxers of skis had higher levels than PFAS. But that's not a very common profession. So other people that get it would be people using machining shops that have mist suppression systems to keep the chrome out of the air. They put mist on the machining to keep the chrome from getting, chrome 6 is very dangerous. And so they suppress the mist with fluorochemicals. And so you inhale that instead. They're going to have pretty high levels. We don't know all the professions that get exposed to that. Often people in manufacturing that make the chemical industrial plants will all be highly exposed as well. So you're not alone. It's in too many products to name in one 3-hour session here. I've seen a list recently of 200 different locations where this thing can be found and 1,400 different chemicals used. So it's really hard to treat chemical by chemical. It's going to be where you find it. It's not that you should go and live afraid of everything, but if you see things advertised as stain resistant or remarkable properties of being water and oil resistant, those are the types of things that you want to look at the label when you buy it and say, hey, it turns out I can live without Teflon. I didn't know I could, but my eggs come out just about as good as they ever did on a ceramic pot. And so I don't think it comes off the Teflon very easily, but I just got rid of them because I don't want to support the industry buying Teflon. So I switched to ceramic, and that's a personal choice. You can make that same choice when you go into textiles and you just ask people, does this have PFAS? They won't know, but the labels will tell you something about its performance characteristics.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How easy or difficult is it to get tested for traces of PFAS?
It's easy if you know how to get around the bureaucracy. It's not cheap. I know there is an outfit that has worked with our committee in Graham called Vista Analytics in El Dorado, California. And it's approximately $850 to get tested for the standard 9 PFAS analytes. The key is being able to try to find a mobile phlebotomist that not only can draw your blood, but then they immediately have to take the blood vials and put them into serum, which means they have to spin all the particulates out because Vista only wants the oils from your blood. Once they do that, they package them up, they put them on dry ice, and you ship them back to California or drive them like I did. I did have my blood tested. I do know what levels are in my blood, whether that's from exposure to the gear for the past 10 years or exposure to the turnouts that I've worn for the 20 years in the fire service. Each state is a little different about how you're allowed to draw your blood. As far as interpreting the results that you get from either Vista or another company is a different result. And I think I'll go back to Graham on that, being able to actually analyze your results, because it's difficult.
Yeah, Jeff makes it sound simple, but he's not a standard firefighter. He worked hard to get that test result done, and it means you often need a medical doctor to write a prescription. You don't have to, as you can find out, but it helps. But most medical doctors couldn't even interpret the results that they came back because it's not something that they do. There's no insurance carrier that's going to insure that at the moment. So nobody's going to pay for it except for you. Your employer is not going to pay for this one. And that makes it difficult to find either a medical doctor and a phlebotomist, or just a phlebotomist that knows how to do this. And then you get the results back and they'll give you numbers. What do those numbers mean? And I read a report just the other day from a firefighter who got them back, and they were the most craziest thing I've ever seen. It was all typed on one page, sideways and straight, and it was all crowded. There was no way to interpret. He had no idea whether he was elevated or not. Turns out he wasn't, but he couldn't read the data that came back. And that I can help you with. I can read the reports. Anybody can do that if they've been in the lab environment, but it's not trivial. So there's sort of barriers at every stage along the way. We'll be happy to help guide you. I mean, Diane especially has connections with people, but we'll point you in the right direction. It's an uphill battle, and we all want Rob to win so that the people can start doing this on a wider scale, because this would be remarkably beneficial if we could get enough blood tested to know what's the correlation between occupations or districts or whatever the heck else is getting this in our blood. That would be a real need to be done. It's been done in a couple of other countries. Australia's got some studies like that, and Sweden's got some studies like that, and they find occupational exposure and they find disease correlations, but just not on the scale that we need yet to show.
And keep in mind, I mean, there are at least the number of labs that are capable of doing this now are increasing, but it's still pretty expensive. And there are a number of labs that can do it, and you may see their names on blood testing information, but they're wanting you to be part of a big group, or they don't necessarily They're not necessarily going to do one person's blood analysis. It needs to be part of a bigger group that's going in. So it's difficult to find these places that will actually do a single sample and do an analysis for you. So definitely take advantage of the information that's out there through Diane and Graham and others, about which labs will actually do this. It's difficult. It's still difficult to get that done.
And I just wanted to comment, Representative Nancy Murphy, one of the 3 original water warriors in our town, along with Representative Kathy Stack, who is also on the Zoom call, she sent me this information regarding blood testing in New Hampshire. We recently passed House Bill 1264 that was sponsored by Senator Chanley, which guaranteed that New Hampshire insurers will now have to cover PFAS blood testing for New Hampshire citizens. So there's another plug for voting for representatives and elected officials that will do the work for you that's needed.
To my knowledge, that's the first state. I don't know of other states that have required that yet. That's very good.
Yeah. We get the work done. All right, the next question. The well at our first home was tested to contain PFAS. I believe current residents were given an opportunity to be tested, but since we no longer live there, we have never been contacted or told how we can find out what our exposure level is or was. And this is another ongoing issue. People are mobile and they get exposed and then they move away.
I don't know what the laws are, Rob, but if there's any way that somebody was previously exposed but doesn't live there now, does that count?
It all depends on the context of what kind of claim you might be pursuing, because even if you were, if you don't live on the property anymore, you probably still have it in your blood, and you probably still have the exposure. So it really just depends on whether you're dealing with, and again, I don't mean to be giving legal advice, I'm just talking generally here, but if you're trying to deal with some sort of property damage, or whether you're dealing with a medical or a health issue, because it really wouldn't matter if you're not on the property anymore. If you're dealing with a health issue, it could still be in you and will likely be in you for quite some time. So the blood data would probably be more important at that point than the water data.
Okay. We've got time for just a few more questions. If you have been exposed while in the military, is there any recourse? And I assume they're talking legally.
And again, this is a very complicated legal issue, but all I can say is, in general terms, it is incredibly difficult if you're dealing with exposure in some sort of government-owned facility, whether it be the military or any other government property. A lot of times there are issues of immunity, workers' compensation, you name it, that make it very difficult. So, a lot of this, unfortunately, is happening outside military bases, or folks that were working on military bases, or were firefighters in the military or on bases. And when you add that government property owner layer of complexity on it, it makes the ability to do things legally incredibly difficult, is the best way I can say to summarize it. It's much more difficult than if you had, a manufacturer that was releasing it right out into your facility or into your drinking water. If there's a government entity involved, it becomes a lot more complicated legally.
Mm-hmm.
I have one piece of good news on that. I have heard of somebody getting VA benefits recently, and that's a long battle. As you know, VA turns very slowly. But I've had an example of a firefighter that got VA benefits for a cancer that he claimed was PFAS related. Don't know if that's a general term or just, but I've heard that.
That's a great point. In fact, I think there is at least some movement to try to have, at least within the firefighting community, some cancers or some health conditions deemed to be linked with PFAS. There are states that have certain health conditions that are determined to be linked or occupational exposure diseases. And I know there's efforts underway right now to have people look at PFAS, and have that be an occupational exposure associated with some of these health conditions. That's incredibly important, but it's ongoing in a number of places right now.
The second to the last question, for people with PFAS contamination in our area, is it safe to have a garden? And I know that Graham, you covered this a little in the chat, but I think people should know.
Oh, the answer is that some plants do bioaccumulate PFAS very well. So things like wheat or stemmed leafy vegetables will actually pick it up from the garden. So if you put down biosolids or if you put down water that's contaminated, it is possible to get it into the vegetables. So I would be concerned if you're in a plume area where you've got drinking water coming out of the same plume. I had that concern in Michigan when they were sprinkling their gardens, and turns out they were just growing grass, so that's fine. But if you put it under a vegetable garden, it's possible to get into that. We see it in the trees and plants, and so if you then eat some of the garden produce, it depends very much on which plant it is, and some of the scientists know which ones. I don't know which ones absorb it better, but there are papers out there that will show that.
Okay, thank you. And the final question, is the blood testing an OSHA issue?
Well, yeah, it's occupational in this case. It should be, but OSHA's got lots of things that they're testing for, right? And this is just one of many. They don't have a large budget, and this is a very expensive test. I think NIOSH is the National Institutes of Health is one that would be very interested in this, and they are funding a study to do this, but it's just recently been started in that sense. Nobody's doing routine blood testing, and that's the trouble. And to the extent that this is occupational exposure, I think it would be a great thing for OSHA to consider, but I don't know if it's on their radar screen.
Okay.
Well, and when I tried to get my doctor, which is, I believe, one of the largest health insurance coverages, Kaiser Permanente in California, she could not do it without a medical reason on why I wanted to do the test. And since I couldn't link anything together on any issues that I was having, I couldn't give her a medical reason. She looked for the test within their database, and it didn't exist. The blood serum for PFAS didn't exist in the entire Kaiser Permanente database. So even if she would approve it, she wouldn't even know how to code it.
Okay, thank you. I know I said that was the last question, but another one just came in that's really good, and I can't not say it. So question for Rob, Graham, and Linda Birnbaum. Could each of you state both of your ideal must-pass federal and state regulations?
I guess I'll start. Really, I think for me, one of the critical things is to stop the ongoing exposures. And that we've been trying to do that at the federal level for quite some time. Right now, I know the focus has been in a lot of states on stopping at least the drinking water exposures and getting, appropriate regulatory guidelines for drinking water in place. And that's starting to happen. We're starting to see that in the states. And if you look at the numbers, the guidelines and the standards in some states are actually adopting enforceable maximum contaminant limits for the first time on some of these chemicals. But what you see is a steady decline in those numbers as to what's an appropriate amount in the water. But we've also got to stop these ongoing exposures in products. The focus has been on the water, but we can't ignore these other sources of exposure and the other places, particularly that firefighting community may be getting exposed, like we've just been discussing all evening here with the foams, with the gear, and other sources of exposure. So whatever can be done, on national or state level, and we're seeing, fortunately, those discussions occurring. There are states that are taking action to address that. There's efforts that have been going on quite some time on the federal level, and hopefully something will eventually happen there. But again, it's my primary focus was stop the ongoing exposures. At least that should be primary number one, in my view.
Okay.
Okay, I'll try. I'm Linda Birnbaum. I haven't spoken at all, but I'm recently retired director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. Graham, Rob, I hear you saying, you know, stop the use. I want to stop the production of these chemicals because we keep making things that will never go away. And I think that we need to look at what, you know, where are these absolutely essential for use, where there are no alternatives. And if there are no alternatives, then we need to do some research to find alternatives, but we really need to stop. Although I would agree with you that most of the focus, especially in our country, has been on drinking water. Both the states of Washington and Maine ban all PFAS from food packaging, and both houses of the New York legislature just both passed bills, and it's sitting on Governor Cuomo's desk to ban all PFAS, also to ban PFAS in food packaging. So there are some movement related to other major sources of exposure. And just a warning, Graham, I'm glad that you're using ceramic cookware, that's fine. If you go to your store and you want to buy coated pans because you think that they cook better, you'll see lots that say no PFOA in them. Be careful, because if it says no PFOA, then there's other PFAS in them. There are a few brands that do say no PFAS, but of course they don't tell you what else they're using instead. So thank you all for letting me speak for a moment.
Thank you.
Excellent, Linda. You should have been here all along. I'll put in my plug for the firefighters right now. There's some legislation that we can do that's low-hanging fruit. I think the example is the National Defense Authorization Act. That's not so easy, but that one actually changed the military's use of firefighting foam just in overnight. When that bill was authorized last year, the firefighting foams, except for aircraft carriers and submarines, is being phased out by 2024. Suddenly the entire military establishment got rid of all their firefighting AFFF, which is amazing. I didn't know that could be done. But along those lines, I'll only pick on one state. I'll pick on Wisconsin because I know it. There's 125,000 gallons of AFFF in Wisconsin, and they're distributed through all the 750 municipal fire departments. Where is that going to go? If we use it on a fire, it's going to go into groundwater. If we don't use it in the fire, we don't get rid of it properly, it's going to go in the groundwater. And so we need state legislatures and houses, state legislature, Senate, House and Senate, to come up with some sort of bill to get rid of the current AFFF and replace it. Because at the moment, the fire chiefs have to pay it out of their own budget. And it's an awful lot easier just to pour it down the drain than to pay $40,000 to get rid of it. We need to pay to get rid of it properly, and they shouldn't be paying out of that budget. They should be paying out of some, and Wisconsin's put a bill through recently to buy back at $250,000 a year for the next 8 years, all the foam that's in the state. And it'll last 8 years, just keep it on the shelf till you can buy it back. And then it goes out to hazardous waste disposal. And you've actually removed it from ever hitting the environment. That's, I think, a low-hanging fruit that individual states can do for not a huge cost, but it will be expensive for the fire departments to replace all that foam, and they need to. So that's where I think targeted legislation could be very effective.
Yeah, Graham, I'd like to just make the point that in 2018, Congress passed the law with an FAA Reauthorization Act, which no longer required the use of AFFF at civilian airports, because that's another major source, and it's no longer required. But there is the same issue that Graham was just talking about, with lots of unused stuff still there.
And I'll jump in one last time. One thing I forgot to say, which probably was implicit, but with all of this, we've got to make sure that the people who actually put this stuff out there, who made these chemicals knowing that they would be going out into our air, into our water, into our blood, into our environment, and would be staying there and causing all the problems we're talking about today, they should be responsible for paying for whatever the costs are to do this. The taxpayers shouldn't have to be funding this. And the states and the water providers and fire departments should not have to be picking up the bill to fund all of this and to clean this up. Those who cause the problem ought to be paying for it, and that ought to be part of anything we're talking about here. But that's my last 2 cents. Well,
and I'm going to add something there. I recently testified in Maine. There extending the statute of limitations for civil cases against PFAS damage. In the state of New Hampshire, we have a 3-year limitation for the statute of limitations. And you know, it accumulates in your body. It can affect a future generation. So for this specific contamination, I'm going to try to put in a bill to extend the statute of limitations. But we have to protect people that have been harmed. That's the bottom line. Okay. And so now I'd like to offer each panelist 1 minute to give us your final thoughts. Rob, we'll start with you.
Well, first, I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight. I mean, this has been an incredibly important discussion. One I hope continues with all of you, and I hope everybody expands this discussion. It's really encouraging to see the folks that are on this call having these talking about these issues, you know, and being passionate about it, making sure that we get answers to these questions. You know, it's incredibly important. And every one of us, you know, can make a huge difference here. Every one of us standing up, speaking out, demanding that this be addressed, that we actually pay attention to this, that we insist that these issues be dealt with and have our voices heard. Something can change. And we have the power to do it. And, let's hopefully keep the momentum going here and do what we need to do to protect the firefighters, our emergency responders, and everyone who's exposed to these chemicals. And thanks to everyone for having the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Diane and Paul?
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Rob. And everyone here tonight. We're so happy to see you. And thank you, Dr. Linda Birnbaum, for joining us. What a privilege it is to see you. I just wanted to say that the fire service should be a cautionary tale in the immersion of these corporate giants within a institution. In our case, it is DuPont and Chemours and Lion and Honeywell and Gore that sit on our safety institutions that decide everything from the balance of a helmet to the width of reflecting gear. And that is by design. So these corporations sit on the voting committees of safety aspects of our gear, but not once did they ever mention that this was a concern. They alone knew the amounts of PFAS used. And I'm very concerned that firefighters were used as a lift-off for price per share. We're very concerned about that. We took on a study, a group of ragtag firefighters that should have been done by our institutions. And instead of getting support, all we've gotten, quite frankly, is double speak and pushback. And we're very concerned about the language that is going out to the fleet of 1 million firefighters, both union and non-union, and the aspect of firefighters hearing that there's no PFO in the gear. Like Dr. Birnbaum just said, what we have is the new precursor, the regrettable substitute that is forming PFOA. And that should concern all of you that are living in areas where the textile manufacturers are making things like Saint-Gobain, etc. So we do also want to just quickly recognize that we have a sense of urgency, as I had written my notes earlier today about this, that Dr. Philippe Grandjean and Dr. Linda Birnbaum have found that an undetectable amount of PFOA can cause a tumor in a lab animal, yet firefighters are handling their gear every day in amounts that may rub up on their fingers, and we're really not being heard on a national level. This should be a national discussion in Capitol Hill. Who knew what and when did they know it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jeff, any final words?
Well, thank you for letting me participate in this Facebook Live event. I think all of us bring some a lot of knowledge to this issue. Rob was the champion of all of this through his battle with DuPont and back east. Yep, thumbs up for him. We're just coming on the back end, but again, thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you. And now it's Graham's turn.
I'm going to do something rare and keep it under a minute. This is all being said. I'd like to call out all the other people, the panelists particularly, but Diane in particular for having started this all. I mean, look what you can do with a will. And, you know, it's a cooperation of many people to get to where we are. We're getting the word out. People are changing, and companies are changing their product lines based on what Diane had started a few years ago. And that's for any of us who feel disadvantaged, who feel threatened by what the pollution has done to our own environment. Stand up, do what's right, get the research done, push and push and push, and things happen. And it's to credit to the people that do that. And I wish I knew more people like her. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'd like to thank Chris Dugan for being the administrator tonight. And I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to share their perspectives on these critical issues, and for everyone who joined us tonight. If you have any additional comments or questions, you can send them to me at wethomas@gmail.com, and I will forward them to the appropriate person. After listening to this information, here's what you can do. Contact your local elected officials and insist on PFAS protection legislation. Raise awareness. Talk to your area leaders. Talk to your neighbors. Spread the word that PFAS is in our environment and it is impacting our health. Sign up for newsletters with current information. I've listed some resources in the group chat that you can click on. So that's it for now. Thank you for attending and for your thoughtful questions. Good night, all. Stay healthy and safe.